We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The wind off Puget Sound carried the sharp tang of salt and diesel as the 10:40 p.m. ferry from Seattle slid through the fog toward Bremerton. On board, 37 passengers huddled in coats, shoulders hunched against the chill seeping through the glass. Among them was 31-year-old computer technician Mar, Aquai Harbor, a small Rachel. The next morning, as promised, she drove to his place, expecting to find him oversleeping. Instead, she found his door locked, the lights off, the bed neatly made, his cat meowing plaintively from the kitchen window. The car keys were missing. The car itself was still at the ferry terminal, driver's door unlocked, engine cold. Inside were his jacket, his ferry receipt, and a crumpled coffee cup half full of liquid gone gray with rainwater. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints, no witnesses who remembered anything unusual. Just fog, silence, and the eerie sense that something impossible had occurred in those few hundred yards between the gangway and the car. The Kitsap County Sheriff's Office opened a missing person report at 2:14 p.m. Detective Harold Bryson, then 39, led the early investigation. He was methodical, pragmatic, and skeptical of mysteries. People didn't vanish in public spaces without someone noticing, he told reporters that evening. They left clues even when they didn't mean to. But the clues in Mark Ellison's case led nowhere. The ferry schedule, the terminal logs, the vehicle registration, all correct. The fog had grounded flights and delayed freighters, yet no one saw a man stumble, scream, or run. The water near the terminal was dredged for days, divers surfacing shivering and empty-handed. The Bremerton docks became a tableau of futility, searchlights slicing fog, dogs whining on wet planks, volunteers calling Mark's name into the endless gray. Rachel Ellison stood among them every night. Clutching a thermos of coffee, her brother would have teased her for oversweetening, her voice hoarse from shouting his name across black water that swallowed sound. In small towns around Puget Sound, people had seen enough disappearances tied to water to draw their own conclusions. He fell in, they whispered, or suicide maybe. Quiet type. Detective Bryson wasn't so sure. The car's unlocked door and untouched engine bothered him. So did the ferry receipt and the single coffee cup. He began mapping every security camera between the ferry dock and the parking lot, a network of grainy analog footage that captured shapes more than faces. On one frame, time-stamped 11:29 to 12 p.m., a figure that could have been Mark appeared in the fog, walking east along the railing. 20 seconds later, the frame cut to static. The tape resumed 35 seconds after that, and the figure was gone. Bryson's report from that night ended with a single line that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Subject appears to vanish from frame. Cause unknown. In the years that followed, Mark Ellison's disappearance would fracture into rumor, folklore, and bureaucratic dust. But buried within those first 48 hours were the details that 23 years later would return under the fluorescent glow of a digital forensics lab and reveal that what everyone thought they knew about Mark's final steps was wrong from the very beginning. Detective Harold Bryson believed in patterns, in the predictable logic of human behavior, in the way truth, no matter how obscured, always left fingerprints on reality. In February 1996, he was still young enough to trust in the solvability of every mystery, though Mark Ellison's disappearance would test that faith in ways he could never have imagined. For the first 72 hours, Bryson worked the case like a man possessed. He interviewed ferry staff, commuters, and anyone who had set foot in the Bremerton terminal that night. Most remembered only the fog, how it turned street lamps into hazy halos, how the air itself seemed alive with moisture and static. A few recalled a tall man in a navy peacoat matching Mark's description walking toward the parking lot, but their accounts faltered under cross-examination. One insisted he saw the man turn left toward the waterfront. Another swore he crossed toward the payphone near the ticket office. None could say what happened after that. There were no screams, no splashes, no cries for help, just the steady, endless hum of the ferry engines fading into distance. Bryson ordered a full search of the waterfront area, bringing in divers from the Coast Guard to comb the dark water beneath the docks. For 3 days they descended into silt and shadow, surfacing with nothing but old fishing line and rusted soda cans. The currents around the terminal were strong, Bryson knew, capable of pulling a body into deeper channels within minutes. Yet something about the stillness of that night made the drowning theory ring hollow. Mark had been a competent swimmer, a cautious man by all accounts, not prone to impulsive decisions or despair. His co-workers described him as reliable, unremarkably content, a man whose life revolved around small routines: morning coffee at Kitsap, Java, Sunday dinners with his sister, late-night programming projects on his aging desktop computer. There were no enemies, no debts, no sudden changes of behavior. He just disappeared, Rachel Ellison told Bryson during their first meeting, her voice trembling as though she still expected her brother to walk through the door mid-sentence. Inside Mark's apartment, Bryson found a world frozen in place. The dishes were washed, a towel hung neatly in the bathroom. A paperback novel lay open on the couch beside a remote control. The answering machine blinked with a single unheard message from Rachel, left at 11:58 p.m. the night he vanished.
"Hey, call me when you're home."
I made too much chili again. Her laughter at the end of the recording was soft and unguarded, the kind of ordinary affection that would later sound unbearable in courtroom exhibits. Mark's workbench in the corner held an open circuit board, the tip of his soldering iron blackened but ready. Bryson stood there for nearly an hour, notebook forgotten, overwhelmed by the peculiar intimacy of a stranger's unfinished life. Everything suggested interruption, not departure. The Bremerton police received dozens of tips in the first month, nearly all useless. A bartender claimed to have seen Mark drinking alone in a waterfront pub days after the disappearance. The grainy security footage proved it was another man entirely. A woman in Tacoma called to report that her neighbor resembled the missing technician. He turned out to be a retired Navy machinist. Each lead fizzled into frustration, and by April, the case had drifted toward the cold case shelf, another name in the thick binder of the vanished. Rachel refused to accept it. She quit her job at the public library, printing flyers that she posted from Port Orchard to Seattle. Every morning she stood at the ferry terminal handing out photocopied sheets, her brother's face gradually fading from black to gray as the toner ran low. "People don't disappear like smoke," she told Bryson one afternoon, exhaustion edging her voice into steel. "If he fell in the water, he'd have surfaced. If he ran away, he'd have called. Somebody knows what happened." Bryson didn't argue. He just didn't know how to tell her that sometimes, in his experience, the world didn't make sense. In June 1996, 3 months after the disappearance, a possible clue emerged from an unexpected source. A maintenance worker cleaning one of the ferry terminal restrooms found a torn piece of paper wedged behind a stall pipe. A phone card receipt, time-stamped 11:41 p.m. on the night Mark vanished. The number dialed was partially legible, 1-800-356. Bryson traced it to Western Long-Distance Services, a pay-per-minute calling network popular before cell phones became widespread. The recipient of the call was unlisted, the destination unknown. It might have meant nothing, just litter caught in a corner, but Bryson couldn't shake the coincidence. The receipt was damp but readable, the last digits of the card number corresponding closely to one found in Mark's apartment. He'd used similar prepaid cards to call clients when traveling. The timestamp suggested that someone had used that card 11 minutes after Mark was last seen on the ferry terminal cameras. Whether that someone was Mark or someone who'd taken it remained impossible to determine. Bryson sent the evidence to the Washington State Crime Lab, but without modern data retention laws, phone card companies purged transaction details within weeks. The trail ended in static. That summer, the Pacific Northwest experienced one of its warmest seasons on record. The fog receded, the tourists returned, and the collective attention of Bremerton shifted toward more solvable tragedies. Car wrecks, domestic disputes, the steady churn of human misfortune that at least provided closure. But for Rachel, every sunset over the Sound was another reminder of absence. She started collecting weather data, ferry schedules, even lunar phases, convinced some hidden pattern connected them to her brother's disappearance. Bryson visited occasionally, offering updates that amounted to little more than sympathy. His department had limited resources. Without new evidence, the case remained an open question nobody could afford to keep asking. By 1999, Bryson had transferred to the Homicide Division in Tacoma, chasing answers that bled rather than evaporated. He carried Mark Ellison's file with him, a thin manila folder among stacks of violence, revisiting it on nights when exhaustion blurred into insomnia. Sometimes he stared at the photographs, the empty parking lot, the fog, the coffee cup, and wondered whether the answer had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Then he'd close the folder and return to the living. 2 decades would pass before the name Mark Ellison resurfaced in any official report. The world had changed beyond recognition. Payphones disappeared, the internet devoured everything, and cell towers mapped human movement with frightening precision. In February 2019, a digital forensics specialist named Detective Laura Monroe joined the Kitsap County Cold Case Unit, part of a statewide initiative to re-examine unsolved disappearances using modern technology. Her supervisor handed her a box of files labeled Bremerton Fog Case 1996. Inside lay Bryson's meticulous notes, the torn phone card receipt preserved in a plastic sleeve, and a single floppy disk labeled Terminal Cameras. Monroe, 34, analytical and quietly relentless, loaded the footage onto a digitization rig in the lab. The black and white video stuttered with static, but modern enhancement software revealed details invisible in 1996. Subtle reflections, shifting shadows, faint distortions that suggested motion beyond the fog. One frame, previously dismissed as camera interference, showed a second figure emerging from behind the ticket booth just as Mark disappeared from sight. The outline was blurred but distinct, taller, heavier, wearing a dark parka with reflective patches. Monroe froze the frame, heart hammering. The timestamp read 11:28:49 p.m. The shadow moved in the same direction as Mark, then vanished into the same wall of fog. She cross-referenced ferry crew rosters and passenger manifests, but no one matching that description appeared on any list. A ghost in the data, she began reconstructing the night using cellular network archives recently released under Washington's Historical Data Transparency Act. Although cell phone usage was rare in 1996, Bremerton's early digital network had logged tower pings for service tests and emergency calls. Within that dataset, Monroe found a brief, unexplained transmission registered near the terminal at 11:43 p.m. from an unassigned number routed through a prepaid system, one linked to Western long-distance services, the same company tied to Mark's discarded phone card. The connection electrified the cold case unit. For the first time, technology had resurrected a signal from the night Mark vanished. Monroe requested permission to cross-reference archived billing data from the defunct phone service, now held by a private collection agency. After weeks of negotiation, she received a microfiche reel containing partial transaction logs from 1996. On frame 112, under the date February 3rd, a single outbound call was recorded from the Bremerton terminal payphone. The destination number traced to a residence in Port Orchard, belonging to Thomas Reed, then a 45-year-old ferry maintenance electrician. Reed's name had appeared once in Bryson's original notes, buried in a list of terminal employees interviewed after the disappearance. His alibi had been simple. He clocked out at 9:30 p.m. and went home to his wife. The couple divorced in 2001, and Reed retired quietly in 2012. By 2019, he lived alone on a wooded property outside Polsbo. Monroe pulled his employment file, average reviews, no disciplinary actions, but multiple mentions of after-hours maintenance logs unsigned or completed off schedule. He'd had keys to nearly every restricted area of the ferry terminal, including the staff access tunnels beneath the parking lot, tunnels that had been sealed and forgotten after a partial collapse in 1998. When Monroe visited the site, escorted by county engineers, she found the entrance behind a chain-link fence near the old generator shed. The tunnel reeked of damp earth and metal. Her flashlight beam revealed narrow maintenance corridors lined with rusted conduits and stagnant puddles reflecting decades of decay. 40 feet in, the passage forked. One branch led toward the main terminal foundation. The other ended abruptly at a bricked wall patched long ago. Spray-painted on the concrete in faded yellow letters was a maintenance code, R150296, the same month Mark vanished. Back at the station, Monroe retrieved Bryson's old case notes again, scanning for any mention of structural maintenance in February 1996. Page 23 held a brief reference. Power flicker at 11:30 p.m. Generator reset by night electrician. No follow-up. She stared at the line until the connection snapped into focus. Thomas Reed had been working near the terminal the night Mark disappeared. His clock-out record could have been falsified. His proximity placed him within yards of the last known location. Monroe contacted Bryson, now 72 and long retired, to share her findings. The old detective listened in silence as she described the digital reconstruction, the shadow figure, the phone card call, the tunnel. When she finished, Bryson exhaled a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. "All these years," he said, "I thought the fog took him." Turns out it was just a man. The renewed investigation gained quiet momentum. Reed's current employer, a part-time electrical contractor for a shipyard, confirmed he still carried toolkits from the 1990s, including one marked with his initials. When investigators executed a search warrant on his property in late 2019, they found dozens of old Ferry maintenance logs neatly stacked in plastic tubs in his garage. Most were routine. One, however, dated February 4, 1996, listed emergency conduit repair beneath terminal platform with no supervisor signature. Taped inside the same folder was a faded Western long-distance phone card receipt, number partially torn, matching the sequence found behind the restroom pipe. When confronted, Reed denied everything, claiming he'd merely used discarded cards for scrap notes. But his calmness frayed when Monroe produced the cell tower record, placing a prepaid call from the terminal to his home number minutes after Mark vanished. His face drained of color. His hands trembled on the table. "That was someone else," he muttered, voice cracking. "They used my number." Forensic technicians later recovered trace human material, microscopic skin cells, from the back of the phone card receipt in Reed's folder. Mitochondrial analysis matched DNA preserved from Mark Ellison's toothbrush in the evidence archive. 23 years after his disappearance, the first biological connection had been established between Mark and the man who last spoke on the terminal phone. As news of the discovery spread through Kitsap County, old ghosts began to stir. Retired workers remembered odd noises under the docks that night. Unexplained power outages, a toolbox left unclaimed near the generator shed. Rachel Ellison, now in her late 40s, sat through the press conference gripping the same thermos she'd carried during the searches in 1996. When a reporter asked what she wanted most from the investigation, she replied softly, "I just want to know where my brother went when he stepped off that boat." Detective Monroe promised she'd find out. But what she was about to uncover beneath the Bremerton terminal would challenge not only the limits of forensic technology, but also the quiet assumptions of an entire town that had forgotten how easily ordinary men can hide extraordinary darkness. The air beneath the Bremerton terminal was thick with salt, rust, and the slow decay of a place forgotten by time. Detective Laura Monroe's flashlight cut a trembling circle through the darkness, catching motes of dust that drifted like ash. The concrete corridor was narrower than she expected, just wide enough for one person to pass through sideways. Pipes ran overhead, corroded and weeping condensation. Somewhere above her, the muffled clang of a ferry loading echoed like a memory. The tunnel had been sealed since 1998 after a partial collapse, officially condemned, unofficially ignored. The city had simply welded the doors shut and built a fence around the problem, a bureaucratic bandage on an infection that no one wanted to see. But Laura saw it. Every detail of the case, Mark Ellison's footprints, the phone card, the fog, pulled her back to this place. If Thomas Reed had been working here that night, if the power outage had drawn him below ground, then this was where the trail had always led. 23 years later, the air still carried the echo of something left unfinished. She crouched near the bricked wall marked with the faded yellow stencil, R150296, and brushed away a film of dust. The numbers were uneven, hand-painted. Fresh mortar lines indicated later repair. She ran her fingers along the seams and felt a subtle hollow behind the bricks, the faint vibration of empty space. When the forensics team joined her hours later, equipped with sonar scanners and ground-penetrating radar, the images confirmed her intuition. Behind that wall lay a cavity roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, rectangular, unnaturally precise. A void. The following morning, demolition crews carefully removed the bricks under supervision. The first swing of the hammer released a gust of air so old it carried the smell of metal, earth, and something else, something faintly organic. When the final bricks came loose, the beam of Laura's flashlight found what decades of fog and rumor had hidden. Inside the cavity was a wooden trunk, water-damaged but intact, its brass hinges corroded into green scars. The lid had been sealed with a strip of electrical tape, the kind used by maintenance crews for quick fixes. Faded letters on the top read Harbor Systems Equipment, Mark Ellison's employer. The forensic pathologist on site, Dr. Jean Patel, recorded every movement as the box was pried open. The interior smelled of silt and oil. Inside were the decomposed remains of a human body curled into a fetal position, skeletal yet unmistakably preserved by the anaerobic environment. Beside the bones lay a cracked pair of wire-rimmed glasses, a corroded wristwatch stopped at 11:38 p.m., and a laminated ID badge bearing a faded photograph. Mark Ellison. Technician, Harbor Systems Repair. The discovery hit Bremerton like a slow-motion explosion. For 2 decades, Mark had been a name whispered in past tense, a cautionary tale told to ferry passengers on foggy nights. Now he was real again, proof that the impossible had only been improbable. The media descended on the quiet coastal town, reporters broadcasting from the docks where the water still smelled of diesel and secrets. Detective Munro stood on the pier the next morning watching divers retrieve additional evidence from the flooded sections of the tunnel. Plastic fragments, a rusted flashlight, a coil of wire with electrical tape matching the trunk seal. Each artifact stitched together a picture of deliberate concealment. The location of the trunk made sense only to someone intimately familiar with the terminal's layout, a maintenance worker who knew which corridors were decommissioned and which records would be buried under layers of bureaucratic neglect. When the coroner's office confirmed the remains as Mark Ellison through dental records, Laura drove directly to Port Orchard to deliver the news to Rachel. The house was small, the yard overgrown with blackberry vines, but the porch light burned even at noon. Rachel answered before the second knock, eyes red-rimmed but steady. She didn't cry when Laura told her. She simply nodded, hands clasped around the thermos she still carried like an anchor. "I knew he was there," she whispered. He was always there. Back at headquarters, the focus shifted from recovery to reconstruction. How had Mark ended up beneath the terminal? Why had the area been sealed without inspection? And most urgently, what role had Thomas Reed played? Reed had worked the night shift on February 3, 1996, as confirmed by payroll sheets recovered from archives. The power flicker at 11:30 p.m. corresponded with a maintenance log initialed TR. The following morning, he filed a routine damage report noting minor electrical surge due to moisture in subfloor conduit. No mention of unusual activity. Yet the proximity to the sealed chamber, the matching electrical tape, and the phone card tied the events together like threads in a snare. Munro obtained a warrant for Reed's home and workshop. The search yielded dozens of vintage electronics, old pagers, discarded modem boards, obsolete power tools. Hidden among them, in a box labeled 1990s project files, were several Polaroids showing maintenance work inside the ferry tunnels. One image, dated February 3rd, captured Reed in a headlamp beside a coiled extension cord. Behind him, partially obscured by shadow, stood a man matching Mark Ellison's build, holding a toolbox. The photo froze time at the moment the two men's paths crossed. Mark had apparently been inside the restricted area with Reed that night, though no records indicated any repair order requiring his presence. Laura enlarged the image digitally, isolating the background. A wall with the same distinctive rust pattern later found near the bricked enclosure. When confronted with the photograph, Reed's composure cracked. That was just a safety check, he insisted. He wanted to see the generator. Curious kid. His voice trembled with the effort of control. He slipped, hit his head. I tried to help. Laura let the silence stretch, the recorder's red light blinking steadily. You sealed the tunnel afterward, she said finally. You filed a fake report, used your own tape, and left him in that box. Reed's gaze dropped to his hands. It wasn't supposed to be like that, he muttered. The water was rising. I panicked. The statement was half confession, half plea, yet it contradicted physical evidence. Mark's skull showed 2 distinct fractures inconsistent with a single fall. Forensic reconstruction suggested blunt force trauma inflicted by an object consistent with a steel flashlight, the same model recovered from Reed's property. The official confession came 4 days later, during a recorded session at Kitsap County Jail. Reed described an argument that began over equipment. Mark had accused him of falsifying maintenance hours, threatening to report him. Tempers flared, words escalated, a blow landed. Mark fell, striking his head on the generator housing. He was breathing, Reed said, tears cutting through grime on his cheeks. I thought he'd wake up, but he didn't. In panic, Reed claimed, he used an empty supply trunk to hide the body, then sealed the section under the pretense of electrical repairs. By morning, the fog had covered everything. But investigators doubted the simplicity of his account. The precision of the concealment, the fake reports, the sealed tunnel, all pointed to calculation, not panic. Prosecutors later argued that Reed had lured Mark below deliberately after discovering that Mark's company contract would soon replace the ferry maintenance team with outside technicians, effectively ending his overtime income. The argument about hours may have been the spark, but greed was the accelerant. The trial in 2020 became a grim ritual of collective remembrance. Old ferry workers testified about the maintenance culture of the 1990s. Handwritten logs, unverified overtime, and quiet favors exchanged for cash. Rachel Ellison took the stand, clutching her brother's glasses, describing 2 decades of uncertainty as a wound that never closed because it didn't know where to bleed. When the prosecution unveiled the recovered trunk in court, still stained by brine, the room fell silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The jurors stared at it as if looking into the mouth of the past. After 3 weeks, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of second-degree murder and evidence tampering. Reed was sentenced to 38 years in Monroe Correctional Complex, a number almost poetic in its symmetry. 1 year for each of Mark's birthdays he'd stolen. He would die there in 2026 from congestive heart failure, leaving behind no family, no letters, and no explanation beyond the fragmented words recorded in his final interview. He was supposed to go home. Detective Monroe closed the file with a sense of unease rather than triumph. She'd solved the puzzle, but the solution felt like a scar. During the months that followed, she visited the old tunnel twice more before the city permanently sealed it. Standing there, she could still smell the rust and the salt, still imagine the hum of electricity and the echo of 2 men arguing beneath a world that kept moving above them. Rachel scattered her brother's ashes from the Bremerton ferry one spring evening, the water calm, the sky burning pink over the Sound. Passengers leaned quietly on the railing as the wind carried fragments of her voice, soft, almost prayerful. "You're home now." The case became a footnote in Washington's criminal history, cited in forensic seminars as an example of how modern technology could resurrect long-buried truths. But for those who remembered the fog of 1996, it was more than a case file. It was proof that darkness can live for decades in the narrow spaces beneath ordinary life, waiting for someone to finally lift the tape and let the light in. And in the cold archives of the Kitsap County Sheriff's Department, under a label reading Ellison, mark closed, the torn phone card still sits in its plastic sleeve, the last relic of a man who stepped off a ferry into nothing and was finally found beneath the feet of everyone who thought they'd forgotten him. By the time the snow returned to the Olympic foothills in early 2021, Bremerton had settled uneasily into the quiet that follows tragedy. The Ellison case had been closed, the ferry terminal refurbished, and the city's tourist brochures rewritten to exclude the word tunnel. Yet for those who'd lived through the 23 years between disappearance and discovery, the silence felt less like peace than like exhaustion. Detective Laura Monroe still carried the case everywhere, an invisible ache behind the ribs, the kind that surfaces when rain begins to fall. Officially, she'd moved on, assigned to cybercrime, a cleaner line of work where evidence lived on hard drives instead of bones. But she couldn't stop replaying the sequence of Mark Ellison's final 40 minutes. How a man could step from light into fog, from existence into myth, and how the truth had waited patiently, boxed in a place no one had thought to look. She spent weekends sorting through the evidence archive before its digital transfer to state storage. The physical files were slated for destruction once scanned, and she couldn't bear the thought of these objects. Mark's glasses, his rusted watch, the fragment of electrical tape, being reduced to pixels. When she handled the items, she imagined the ferry hum beneath her feet, the mist on her skin, the taste of diesel and salt. The sensory weight of the story anchored her in a world where facts still mattered. But with every document she cataloged, she found gaps, procedural holes, missing signatures, field reports written in shorthand that only the original detective could decode. Harold Bryson had been living in a retirement complex outside Tacoma since his wife's death. Laura visited him one gray morning armed with coffee and curiosity. He was thinner, frailer, but his eyes still carried the restless intelligence that had filled his reports with margin notes and theories. When she mentioned the case, his gaze drifted toward the window where mist curled around fir trees. "You know what bothered me most?" he said finally. "Not the fog. not the lack of witnesses. It was the call. He was referring to the Western long-distance record, the phone call from the terminal to Thomas Reed's home. I could never prove it was him, Bryson continued, but I always wondered if there was someone on the other end. Someone who picked up. Laura frowned. You think Reed wasn't alone? Bryson smiled sadly. No one ever is. Not really. That night she reopened the digital case file. The call logs had been archived along with state telecommunication records. When she isolated the signal metadata, a new anomaly emerged. An inbound connection to the same terminal payphone logged 32 seconds before the outgoing call. Two numbers communicating back-to-back through a relay network now long defunct. Whoever dialed first had reached the phone moments before Mark disappeared. The system registered only the exchange, not the caller. Laura spent the next 2 months tracing the ghost number through obsolete infrastructure. Most databases had been deleted or migrated, but an old Bell Systems archive preserved fragments of routing data. The inbound number originated from an apartment complex in Silverdale, 20 miles away, and owned in 1996 by the Reed Family Trust. Property records showed that Thomas Reed had rented the unit to a cousin, Eleanor Paxton, a ferry dispatcher. When Laura pulled Paxton's personnel file, she found she'd resigned abruptly in March 1996, citing family illness. Her forwarding address led to Oregon, then vanished. No death certificate, no tax filings. It was as if she too had stepped into fog. The new lead was tenuous, but it gnawed at Laura's sleep. What if Reed hadn't acted alone? What if the call that night had been part of coordination, rather? Then coincidence? She reopened the evidence photos of the trunk. Among the corroded hinges and warped wood, she noticed a detail she'd overlooked, the faint outline of shipping stencils on the underside. Property of WS. Maint Div. B. That marking didn't match the ferry's supply inventory, but rather the Department of Transportation's secondary depot, the one Eleanor Paxton had overseen as logistics clerk. The implication was chilling. Reed hadn't merely grabbed a random crate. He'd selected a specific one he knew could vanish without record. Laura requested storage manifests from the 1990s, most of which existed only on microfilm. 3 reels. Later she found the entry, crate serial 11B142, logged as MISC electrical stock. Its sign-out date matched the night of February 3rd, approved by dispatcher E. Paxton. The pattern solidified into conspiracy. Whether Paxton had known Mark was dead or simply helped cover a mistake remained unclear, but the logistics were too perfect to be accidental. The only question left was where Paxton had gone. Laura traced fragments of her name through employment databases until she landed on a nursing license registered in Coos Bay, Oregon, under Eleanor Reed Paxton, renewed continuously from 2001 onward. Married name, same birth date, same middle initial. She'd built a new life on the southern coast, working quietly at a long-term care facility. The Washington prosecutor's office approved Laura's request for a background inquiry. What she found in Paxton's personnel file surprised even her. Disciplinary notes for hoarding patient belongings. A reprimand for using outdated disinfectant labeled industrial grade. The cleaning compound listed in the report contained the same surfactant compound that laboratory analysis had found on Mark Ellison's coat fibers. Laura drove south in March 2021, a storm chasing her down the coast highway. She found Eleanor at the nursing home side entrance, smoking behind a dumpster, gray hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes pale and wary. When Laura introduced herself, the woman's shoulders stiffened as if bracing for a long-awaited reckoning. I already heard about Tom, she said before Laura could speak. They said he confessed. He did, Laura replied, but he didn't act alone. The woman's cigarette trembled between her fingers. You think I helped him? I think you knew what happened and you helped him hide it. For a long time, the only sound was wind scraping metal. Finally, Eleanor dropped the cigarette into a puddle. He called me that night, she whispered. Said there'd been an accident. He was scared. He told me to log the crate out so it wouldn't raise questions. I thought he'd hit something with the truck, not... She stopped, swallowing hard. When I realized it was too late. The concrete was sealed and he said he'd handle the paperwork. Laura studied her face, the fine network of wrinkles etched by years of silence. Why didn't you come forward? I told myself the boy was already gone, Eleanor said. Tom was family. Blood comes first, but it never stopped. Every time the fog rolled in, I'd see his face. The confession, though partial, was enough. Eleanor Reed Paxton was charged as an accessory after the fact, but her health failed before the case reached trial. She died of pneumonia 2 months later, leaving behind a handwritten statement detailing how she'd falsified the crate release and destroyed security logs at her cousin's request. The document closed the final gap in the Ellison timeline. When the file reached the state archives, journalists clamored for comment, eager to frame the story as another parable of small-town corruption. But Laura refused interviews. She understood that beneath the procedural victory lay something larger, the slow rot of fear, loyalty, and silence that had allowed one man's panic to metastasize into 2 decades of torment. That summer, she visited the ferry terminal alone at dusk. The renovations were complete, the tunnels filled with concrete, the walls painted a sterile white. Yet if you stood near the railing at the right hour, when fog crept over the sound, and the gulls fell quiet, you could still hear the hum beneath the boards, the ghost resonance of engines, voices, and a phone ringing unanswered in the night. Rachel Ellison joined her there one evening in late July. She'd started volunteering with a missing persons advocacy group, speaking to families whose grief was still raw. "They always ask me how you live with it," she told Laura, eyes on the water. "I tell them you don't. You just learn to keep breathing." Together they watched the ferry lights fade into the horizon, twin trails reflected across black water. "Do you ever wonder what he was thinking?" Rachel asked quietly. "Mark?" "Yes. The moment he realized something was wrong." Laura hesitated. "I think he thought he could fix it. People like him always do." Rachel nodded slowly, as if that answer contained a kind of peace. Long after she left, Laura stayed by the railing, replaying the investigation like a looping film. The receipts, the phone logs, the tunnel, the confession. She realized the case had changed her in ways she hadn't noticed, her patience now tinged with melancholy, her certainty replaced by humility before the sheer persistence of the past. In the official record, the Ellison case ended with 2 convictions and 1 sealed tunnel. But stories, Laura knew, didn't obey paperwork. They lingered in the spaces between facts, in the breath before dawn when fog erases the line between water and sky. Somewhere in that gray distance, the ferry's horn sounded, a long, mournful note that drifted through the mist like memory itself, refusing to fade. The Ellison file should have ended with signatures, seals, and a quiet transfer to the state archives. But in late autumn of 2021, something strange began to surface. Small inconsistencies buried deep in digital conversions of the original evidence logs. Detective Laura Monroe noticed it first while reviewing the scanned inventory. Each exhibit had been photographed, tagged, and digitized by the Department of Records. But on one image, the photo of Mark's recovered wristwatch, metadata showed a timestamp that didn't belong. Embedded in the image file was an encoded comment string. 11:43, he called again. Laura stared at it for nearly an hour before accepting that it wasn't an accident. Someone had inserted that message during the digitization process, either as a note or as a hidden file comment. She traced the upload to an external subcontractor based in Spokane, North Cascade Archival Services, and drove there the following week. The office was a dim warehouse filled with the low hum of scanners and the smell of toner. A young technician named Eli Harmon looked up as she flashed her badge. "Do you embed notes in your files?" she asked. He blinked, puzzled. "Only internal batch codes, not text." "Why?" She showed him the printout. He frowned, leaned over the monitor, and pulled up the raw metadata. The phrase was there, unmistakably typed into a field labeled Technician's Comment. But the batch log listed his supervisor, D. Cleary, as the one who'd processed that file. Cleary had retired 2 months earlier and moved to Oregon. Laura found him living in a mobile home near Astoria, half blind from cataracts, chain smoking by a propane heater. When she asked about the file, he chuckled. "Wasn't me," he said, voice like gravel. "We just scanned what they sent. But that line," he called again, "that's in one of the tapes. The old Ferry security reels. I remember hearing a voice when I digitized it. Thought it was interference. What kind of voice? Man's voice. Said, he called again. Get down there. Then static. Laura's heart tightened. Which tape? Cleary shook his head. Could have been any of them. They were all labeled wrong. But it was the Bremerton batch, mid-90s. Gave me chills. Back in Seattle, she pulled the digital archives from storage and cross-referenced all audio logs tagged from the ferry terminal. Most had been silent surveillance, no microphones. But one backup reel, mislabeled as Generator Maintenance Audio 1996, contained a 47-second segment of analog sound. Mechanical hum, distant voices, then faintly, a male tone distorted by static. He called again, get down there. The voice was low, hurried, and overlapped by the rumble of engines. She played it repeatedly, isolating frequencies, filtering noise until words emerged with painful clarity. The second voice, a response, was unmistakably Thomas Reed. I'm already here, he said. The implication was staggering. It meant Reed wasn't alone the night Mark vanished. Someone else, likely topside, had been monitoring communications, possibly coordinating the cover-up. The earlier theory about Eleanor Paxton helping to falsify records still held, but this suggested operational awareness from another level, someone in the chain of command. Laura traced the original maintenance network structure and discovered that in 1996, the ferry's electrical system had been monitored by an external contractor, Nordev Systems, subcontracted through the Department of Transportation. Their logs listed an on-call technician stationed remotely in Seattle on February 3rd, Douglas Harrow, age 38 at the time. Harrow's personnel file was thin. Electrical engineer, maritime systems consultant, employment terminated in 1998 after a series of safety violations. No forwarding address. But a background check revealed he'd later opened a small communications repair shop in Poulsbo under the name Harrow Electronics, closed in 2015. His last known address was an assisted living facility in Tacoma. When Laura visited him, Harrow was 73, frail but lucid, his hearing aided by a small device behind his ear. She began gently, asking about his work with Nordev. He squinted at her badge. That was a lifetime ago, he murmured. Why dig it up? Because a man named Mark Ellison disappeared the night you were on call. Recognition flickered in his eyes like a spark. The fog case, he said softly. Reed was a good electrician, sloppy paperwork, but good hands. You're telling me he killed that kid? He confessed. Harrow exhaled. Then I guess that explains the call. He told her that the ferry terminal had a radio patch line connecting maintenance staff with Nordev's Seattle control office. Around 11:40 p.m. that night, the channel crackled alive unexpectedly. Reed said something about a power fault, told me to log an incident delay. Then I heard another man in the background, panicked, like he'd fallen. I asked if everything was all right, but the line cut. Laura leaned forward. Another man? Yeah, younger voice. Thought he said, don't seal it. Then static. After that, Reed called again 5 minutes later, said it was resolved. Did you report it? I did, Harrow said, eyes wet. Filed the radio transcript the next morning. They told me to drop it. Said it was a training miscommunication. I didn't push it. You didn't question authority back then. Laura's pulse quickened. Who told you to drop it? Project manager. Guy named Collins, I think. Or maybe Callan. They rotated people all the time. The Nordev archives had long been absorbed by private corporations, their data scattered across mergers and bankruptcies. But after weeks of searching, she located a partial directory from 1996 listing project manager Richard Callan. The same Callan had later joined WSDOT's infrastructure audit team, the department that approved the closure of the Bremerton tunnels in 1998. Now the entire sequence aligned with unnerving precision. An on-call supervisor suppressing a report, authorizing the sealing of an area that concealed a body. Whether it was complicity or bureaucratic self-preservation, it had ensured that Mark Ellison's disappearance remained unsolved for decades. Laura presented her findings to the district attorney, but Callan had died in 2011, his estate settled quietly in Olympia. Without a living witness, prosecution was impossible. Still, the department issued a statement acknowledging administrative oversight contributing to delayed discovery. For Rachel Ellison, it was another wound reopened. She met Laura at a diner overlooking the Sound, the same water that had swallowed her brother's name for so long. "Do you ever think about how many people had to look away for this to happen?" she asked. "All the time," Laura said. "It's never just one person, it's a chain." Rachel nodded. "Then break it." Those words stayed with Laura long after the case file faded from headlines. In early 2022, she proposed a statewide review of historical maintenance deaths and disappearances along Washington's Ferry network. The initiative, dubbed Project Soundline, cross-referenced 30 years of missing persons data with infrastructure reports. Within months, analysts flagged 2 other unexplained disappearances, both Ferry employees, both during maintenance outages supervised by Thomas Reed's crew. Neither case had been properly investigated. The findings triggered an internal audit and a public inquiry. Laura testified before the committee in Olympia, describing how outdated systems, unregulated subcontracting, and data loss had allowed crimes to vanish in plain sight. Her voice trembled only once, when she mentioned Rachel. "For every name, we recover," she said. "There's a family that stopped believing the system remembers them. Our job is to make the system remember." The inquiry led to sweeping reforms: standardized maintenance tracking, open access archives, digital redundancy. Bureaucratic victories, maybe, but for Laura they felt like fragments of redemption. Yet the emotional toll remained. She began dreaming of the tunnel again. The bricked wall, the hum of distant machinery, Mark Ellison's watch ticking underwater. In one dream she found herself trapped in the narrow passage, bricks closing, in the static whispering through her earpiece. He called again. By 2023, she'd transferred to a training post, teaching forensic reconstruction to new recruits. On the first day of class, she displayed a photo of fog over Puget Sound and asked, "What does a missing person look like?" The room stayed, silent until she answered herself, "It looks like nothing at all until you learn where to look." That winter, Bremerton unveiled a memorial near the terminal. A bronze plaque set into the walkway bearing Mark Ellison's name and the inscription, "Time does not erase truth, it only waits to be found." Rachel stood beside Laura during the dedication. Ferries passed behind them, their horns low and mournful. Tourists paused to read the plaque, unaware of how many ghosts floated in the mist beyond the railings. When the ceremony ended, Rachel handed Laura a small box. Inside lay the corroded wristwatch, restored and still set to 11:38. "They said I could keep it," she said. "I thought it should stay with someone who listens to time." Laura smiled, though her eyes glistened. "You know it doesn't run anymore." "Neither did he," Rachel replied softly. "But you still found him." That night, alone in her apartment, Laura placed the watch on her desk beside the torn phone card, the 2 relics aligned like coordinates on a map only she could read. She thought about patterns, about how a single call could ripple through decades, turning silence into confession. The city outside was quiet, blanketed in fog. Somewhere across the water a ferry horn moaned, a sound older than memory, echoing against invisible shorelines. For the first time in years, she let herself imagine Mark not as evidence, but as a person walking toward his car, coffee cooling in his hand, unaware that his story would become the weight she carried through every investigation that followed. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, in the deep static of the night, she thought she heard a voice, faint, calm, familiar, saying, "Thank you." By 2024, the fog returned to the Sound the way guilt returns to memory, slowly, without warning, and impossible to ignore. Bremerton had changed. New glass ferry docks, digital kiosks, a polished boardwalk that tourists loved to photograph. But beneath the veneer of progress, something still pulsed. The weight of a story that refused to die. Detective Laura Monroe had retired 6 months earlier. 53, silver streaks in her hair, still waking at 4:17 every morning without an alarm. The habits of the job clung like the smell of metal on hands, permanent, familiar. Her days were quiet now, morning walks along the shoreline, coffee, from Sam's diner, still using the chipped mugs, then hours cataloging unsolved cases for the Washington Cold Files initiative she'd founded after Project Soundline. But one case kept her anchored to the past. Not the Ellison disappearance itself, but something adjacent, something that had gone unnoticed until the files were digitized. In April 2024, an intern flagged a forgotten entry from February 10, 1996, 4 days after Mark vanished. The log noted a missing maintenance diver during post-storm inspection. The diver's name, Gregory Holt, age 29. His body had never been recovered. The file was thin, 2 pages, a single blurry photograph, and a line written by the original sheriff investigator, presumed swept out to sea. But the coordinates of the dive site, a drainage outflow less than a mile from the ferry terminal, made Laura's pulse quicken. She requested the sonar maps produced during the Ellison excavation in 2019. The 3D scans had revealed cavities beneath the tunnel, one of which had been dismissed as geological depression. But the location matched Holt's last dive log exactly. Something clicked. She met with the state's Marine Recovery Unit. They agreed to re-examine the site using magnetometric sensors, newer tech that could detect metallic anomalies deep under sediment. 3 days later, Laura stood on the pier watching the sensors sweep in arcs across the water. At 11:52 a.m., the operator called out, "We've got something. Human size. Metal around it." Divers went down. 15 minutes later, a black shape rose through the gray water. The corroded remains of a diving harness, the tank half-eaten by rust, still attached to a skeletal frame. Inside the chest cavity, trapped beneath layers of silt, was a laminated ID badge, Gregory Holt, Harbor Systems diving technician. Forensic teams confirmed the remains within a week. Holt's disappearance, once an unfortunate footnote, now shimmered with significance. The dive. Timestamp on his logbook read 11:36 p.m., February 3, 1996, 2 minutes before Mark Ellison's watch stopped. Laura's old instincts roared back to life. Holt had been in the water at the exact moment the power outage occurred. The same night, the same location. What had he seen? She pulled Holt's personnel records from storage. He'd been assigned to inspect the underwater conduit, feeding the ferry's electrical grid, the same conduit where Reed had reported a moisture fault. The diving manifest listed a secondary contact for his shift supervisor, T. Reed. The implications hit like ice. Holt had been working under Reed's direction that night and never surfaced. Reed's confession had never mentioned a diver. Perhaps he hadn't known Holt was there, or perhaps he'd known exactly. Laura spread the evidence across her kitchen table. Diagrams, tide charts, maintenance logs. The blizzard of paper felt like time collapsing back on itself. Then she noticed something odd. Holt's dive plan, logged at 9 RPM, included a radio check scheduled for 11:40 p.m. He was supposed to confirm conduit clearance before power restoration. No such check had ever been recorded. But Reed had logged his incident resolution at 11:43. Holt had been alive at 11:40 and gone by 11:43. The simplest answer was brutal. Holt had surfaced through the maintenance hatch during Mark's confrontation with Reed and seen something he wasn't supposed to. Reed panicked. 2 deaths in the same 10 minutes. One body hidden in a tunnel, another lost to the tide. But the tide had given one back. Laura reopened the sealed evidence photos of the trunk recovered in 2019. Along the inner edge of the lid, barely visible under corrosion, she saw parallel scratches, thin, diagonal, not random. She enlarged the image, adjusted contrast. The lines weren't scratches. They were letters. 4 of them. H-O-L-T, her breath caught. Holt's name had been carved into the inside of the trunk before it was sealed. That meant he'd seen it, or maybe touched it, before it vanished beneath the bricks. She contacted the forensic metallurgy lab in Olympia, asking them to re-examine the trunk's surface for tool marks. When results came back 2 weeks later, they confirmed. The letters had been etched from outside inward, by someone dragging a sharp edge through soft corrosion long after initial burial. The marks were fresh, less than 10 years old. That discovery upended everything. If Holt had died in 1996, who had scratched his name into the trunk sometime after 2010? The lab found microscopic traces of stainless steel dust matching a maintenance blade, the kind used by ferry technicians during the 2000s. The signature of the etching matched that model precisely. There was one man still alive who'd worked that maintenance route before retirement, Eli Harmon, the same technician who'd digitized the records and found the strange message. He called again. When Laura visited him again, his easy smile faltered. "You think I did that?" he said quietly. "I think you knew more than you told me." He nodded slowly. "My father worked under Reed. Back then, he was part of the same maintenance rotation. He told me once, after the body was found, that he'd seen something in 2009, a sealed panel in the tunnel, half exposed during renovation. He opened it, saw the crate and the name Holt carved faintly. He scratched it deeper so it wouldn't be forgotten. Then he welded the panel shut again, because no one wanted to deal with permits." Laura stared at him. "Why didn't he report it?" "He thought it was superstition. Let the dead stay where they lie," he said. That phrase echoed in Laura's mind as she left the workshop. Let the dead stay where they lie. But they hadn't. The Ellison case had resurrected ghosts from every direction. Reed, Paxton, Harrow, Callan, now Holt. Layers of guilt sedimented into history. And yet each revelation felt like another confession forced into daylight. In November 2024, a memorial for Gregory Holt was added beside Mark's plaque. Rachel attended, placing 2 roses. One for her brother, one for the diver who had unknowingly tied their fates. After the ceremony, as the crowd thinned, she turned to Laura. "Does it ever stop?" Laura shook her head. "No, but it gets quieter." That winter, Laura began writing, not a report, but a personal chronicle. She called it The Quiet Line, named after the radio channel that had carried Mark's final moments. The manuscript wove together transcripts, diary notes, and fragments of her own sleepless thoughts. She wrote about fog as both weather and metaphor, about how systems forget until someone insists on remembering. Halfway through, she found herself describing the tunnel again. The smell of rust, the sound of her own breathing amplified by darkness. She realized she was no longer writing about Mark or Reed or Holt. She was writing about herself, about every investigator who'd stared into the void long enough to see their reflection looking back. When she finished, she printed one copy, sealed it in a waterproof envelope, and left it at the memorial under the plaque. A quiet offering to a story that had consumed 2 generations. That night, the fog rolled in thicker than it had in years. The ferry lights glowed like orbs across the sound. Somewhere in that white expanse, a single horn sounded, low and distant. Laura listened, her breath visible in the cold. She imagined the sound traveling across time, through the static of radios, through the sealed tunnels, through every unanswered call. She thought of Mark, walking off the ferry with his coffee still warm. Of Holt descending into dark water, unaware he'd become part of a secret buried under concrete. Of Reed, staring at his hands, realizing too late that truth doesn't dissolve. It waits. And of herself, one small voice in a long line of those who refuse to forget. When she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. A voicemail, time-stamped 11:43 p.m. Static filled the first few seconds, then silence, and finally, a faint whisper. He called again. The message traced back to no number, no origin, no log. The technician later claimed it was likely an auto-synchronization glitch, a digital echo of an old file re-uploaded by mistake. But Laura knew better. Some stories don't end. They reverberate, like sound beneath water, like a signal through fog, like the pulse of a heart that refuses to be silenced.